Finally, a good mystery. Hey there, everyone! Welcome back to Afrodo Reviews, where we decide, is that book worth reading over second breakfast? Or does it deserve the fiery pits of Mount Doom? So let's decide. You know, as often as you've seen me hit that, you think you get used to it, huh? Murder on the Orient Express is an Agatha Christie novel that was first published as a U.S. serialization in the Saturday Evening Post from the 30th of September to the 4th of November in 1933. However, the Goodreads has the first novel published as January 1st, 1934. While 1934 might be the year, I have also noticed that Goodreads tends to put January 1st when it doesn't know the exact date that a book was released in that year. So take that specific with a bit of a grain of salt. It is the 9th novel in the Hercule Poirot, I said it right this time, detective series. Now, being a book that was written by Agatha Christie and was published in 1934, which was almost 100 years ago now, this book has seen its fair share of adaptations. For example, it was turned into a radio broadcast from December 1992 to January 1993 by BBC Radio 4. It was a 4-part radio broadcast series during that time. However, in 2017, an Audible radio broadcast was released along with a 1966 Soviet broadcast. So it's gotten its fair share of radio broadcast. Honestly, I kind of wish I had lived in those times where they would tell stories over radio broadcast. I mean, I've listened to a couple in the Fallout, the Fallout 3 where it has that... 3 guys. Fallout 3 where it has that running radio series in the background if you listen to Galaxy News Radio.
You're listening to the adventures of me, Herbert Daring Dashwood, and my stalwart ghoul manservant Argyle.
But when it comes to filmmaking adaptations, there's only about 2, well, technically 3, but for right now 2 that are well known. There's the 1974 adaptation directed by Sidney Lumet. I'm going to say Lumet, probably. Sounds French. And produced by John Brabourne and Richard B. Goodwin. And the 20th Century Fox adaptation that was released in 2017. Reading that was in 2017 when I still distinctly remember watching the commercials has done a significant job of making me feel very old. But those aren't the only adaptations of this work. There was television adaptations as well, such as the 1955 German adaptation as an episode of the West German television series Die Galerie der Groben Detective. I may have a lot of German in me, but I do not speak German, so forgive me. CBS also produced a 2001 modernized adaptation starring Doc Ock as the titular detective, and it was not well liked, apparently. That is the one thing I could find on it, is that it is not well liked. And now, while this is technically a movie, it is a made-for-television movie. So I figured I'd include it with the television adaptations rather than the movie adaptations. Apart from that, there was a 2010 television adaptation by ITV Studios and WGBH-TV, and a Japanese adaptation in 2015 by Fuji Television. Finally, among the various, there was a stage play adaptation written by playwright Ken Ludwig, that was shown in 2017, a 1985 board game, and a point-and-click adventure released in 2006 by Windows. Although in that, you technically play as a completely different character from Poirot, who is sick in his cabin. So it's kind of like a soft adaptation, I'm assuming. I never played personally. I didn't actually get into PC gaming until, I wouldn't say recently, but it was probably like 7-8 years ago, so yeah, see previous. Honestly, truth be told, reading the sheer amount of adaptive works that this book has, it's shocking that I've never actually experienced the story. At least not directly. Like I said, it is possible I've seen a couple of it through, cultural osmosis, sort of like her, and then there were none. Apart from that, the only thing to really talk about was its reception, and this is one of the few books that is old, and I've actually found reliable sources saying how it was received at the time. Unlike Carmilla, which I couldn't really tell you. In this book, Now and Today, this is about the accurate summary of how it's received. After that, what comes next? Well, the cover. And I'm going to have to respectfully bow out on this one. Now, normally I would go into the cover, discuss the aspects of the cover that make it work, the blend of colors, the interest that the, main image on the front gives you, combined with how well it tells you what's going on in the story and what good hints that it gives you, or if it's a lying cover just to get you interested. However, when it comes to this, that's kind of hard. With this book, it is so old and so well known that at a certain point, it is fair to say that the covers don't really matter for it anymore. Sort of in the same vein as Jane Eyre or The Hunchback of Notre Dame, or things like that. Things that are so old, so well known that honestly, you could give me a blank cover and slap it on there, and most people would know the book that you're talking about. Most people would be interested because through sheer word of mouth, they've heard of this story, most likely. So when I think about how to review the cover, it doesn't seem fair, really, to review a cover on a book so old the same way I would review a book like that was published 2 years ago. That being said, there's also the issue that this book that I currently have was part of a box set. Now, as I've told you guys before, I buy a lot of my books at thrift stores. So naturally, the books I get are one or separated from, like this one, separated from a box set. And I know for a fact that when you buy stuff from a box set, it is designed to look nice in the box set itself rather than as a separate book. So I can't really fairly judge this cover the same way I would others. In addition to that, there are so many covers for this book for 100 years of publication that I would be here for days trying to look up every cover. So with that, we'll move on. And after the cover, always comes the synopsis. Now, for those of you who don't know the synopsis of Murder of the Orient Express, I read through the back on my TBR, which I do recommend checking out. It gives you a fair idea of what I'll be doing this month, as well as me reading the synopsis in the back of every book of my main TBR that I'm going to read. It's a fairly simple plot. I can't really go into too much depth without spoiling. So the basics of it are just Hercule Poirot is traveling on a train called the Orient Express as he heads back home after solving a case abroad. However, during the travel, a passenger is murdered, and after a storm causes the train to come to a halt for several hours, if not a couple days. Never actually states how long the train is stalled here because the book ends before they're freed. Hercule Poirot is forced to try and find the killer because, they can't just sit there with a killer on board the entire time. And that's basically the bulk of the book. Most of the book after that is investigating. Like I said, not much else to say without going into and just spoiling it. So, let's move on. Let's talk about the review. Now, what did I think about this book? I loved it. Yeah, maybe my perception has been painted by the amount of awful mystery novels I've read throughout my channel career. But simply put, I really love this mystery book. It was quite frankly a breath of fresh air, which is ironic considering that it's almost 100 years old and it should be more like musty, stale air. Something that was good at its time, but, it's evolved so much. The things have evolved so much that this should be just filled with cliches that have been overworn. But it's not. Well, kinda is, but it's not. The mystery was compelling, the setting was unique, the characters were interesting. There was just so much about this book that worked. Even who the victim was something that was interesting and worth delving into. Making you uncertain about the circumstances of his death, making you think about why he was killed, making you even question, maybe he deserved it, and should Hercule Poirot actually find the killer after this? Truth be told, this might be a relatively short review section because, if I had a choice, I would just sit here and gush about the book for a good 30 minutes. I really loved it, but being a mystery, I can't talk too in-depth on it without spoiling. And I want people who go into it to have some manner of surprise. One thing I can say is the reason this book was so interesting is I actually recognized a fair amount of the references squeezed in. Like, there was a crime in here, not the main crime, but sort of a background crime, that felt very heavily inspired by the Charles Lindbergh kidnapping case. Well, the Charles Lindbergh baby kidnapping case. Like, basically, it feels like it was ripped from the headlines, reorganized, and then put in the book. And it was great because I recognized a lot of the story being told. So I was just kind of like, oh, that's clever, that's neat. It was the modern day Law and Order, as you know. The past Law and Order. It wouldn't be the modern day Law and Order unless I was back then, so, whatever. That being said, there are a couple of things about this book that I don't think have aged great. Now, I want to be fair and talk about them, but I also want to acknowledge that these are mostly minor nitpicks in the grand scheme of things, because I do think, well, one major one is the fact that it's not something that's aged well. And the second one might just be something that was fair for its day. Well, I mean, both are technically fair for its day since this was in 1934. But before I get to thing, let's get into it. The main thing about this book that definitely got me a bit was it is definitely a product of its time. As there is a fair amount of casual racism in here that would just not fly today. Including assumptions being made based solely on the race of another character. Monsieur Bok. I'm going to call him Book or Bok because that just feels like what he should be called, but I know I'm going to be saying it wrong the entire time. So Monsieur Bok is basically the owner of the train, and he heavily believes that the Italian passenger did it because the victim was stabbed several times, and Italians are known for stabbing and being very passionate. Therefore, an Italian would make the most sense as the perpetrator. However, Perrault argues that no, this crime was carefully thought out. It was cold and calculated, much more the works of an Anglo-Saxon mind. And it just comes off very heavily like phrenology, a whack science back then that was very racist. Let's leave it at that. It was a very racist science. I don't think it's quite exactly. I think it's more. I'm not really gonna go too deep into it, but it's more one of the other sciences that are racist. So, but there was one scene that was a product of its time that actually kind of made me laugh, as opposed to just kind of. Now, I want you guys to keep in mind, this book was published in 1934, at least according to Goodreads. Mind you, 1934. This is before 1939. That's an important date. Yes, I have heard, monsieur. It is abominable, wicked. The good God should not allow such things. We are not so wicked as that in Germany. So, the context there is about child. Oh my God, how am I going to word this without YouTube freaking, clamping down on me? Child unalivement. Child termination. The more I say this, the worse I feel saying it. So we'll just move on. But, remember, Germany is not that wicked. In 1934, at least. Let's not talk about the 1940s. That's kind of a dark humor laugh. I'll probably go to hell for it. But let's move on. I will give the narrative the credit this, though. The narrative itself never agrees with these points of view. It is a third-person narrative, and unlike the bookish life of Nina Hill, the narrative is actually objective rather than as biased as the characters. So it does feel like that these are the opinions of the character and not necessarily saying this is the truth of the world. So there is that. Now, the second point I had was the gathering of the evidence and the main bulk of the book might come off as boring to some people. Most of the book is actually basically an elongated interrogation of every passenger. A good portion of the book is literally just Perrault, Monsieur Bok, and the doctor, whose name I'm forgetting, bringing in a passenger, interrogating them, and then sending them out and sending in a new passenger, and then starting the whole process over again. Now, while there is some clear interest here and there where, Perrault changes his attitude based on what he thinks will get the most information out of that passenger, and the small subtleties of, if you're attentive, you notice some of the small subtleties hinting who it might be. But I can see it being very boring to a more modern audience who's used to more action as the detectives find their clues. I personally didn't mind it too much, but I did want to be fair and bring that up. Again, to me, it's a very minor nitpick. But yeah, apart from that, I don't have any real complaints about this book. It's a very decent mystery. And even though I was able to guess who the culprit was about halfway through, I will say that there was enough twists and turns that I was still surprised by the ending, which is amazing because every detective book I've read so far, I've guessed exactly who it was with no shock at all. So, final conclusion, 8 out of 10. They don't call Agatha Christie the Mistress of Mystery for nothing. I also don't know if they call Agatha Christie the Mistress of Mystery, so that's just me making things up. But the book definitely showcases her talent for writing mysteries. And like I said, even though I had guessed who the culprit was before the end, there was still enough twists and turns in the mystery itself that made me like, whoa, I did not see that coming. And I can say I very much walked away satisfied with what I read in comparison to almost every other mystery I've read on this channel. Honestly, like I said, it's a little sad that something over a century old is more satisfying than modern day works. But so obviously, with the rating that high, the question of does it deserve Mount Dew is very obviously no. This book I would recommend for anyone looking for a decent mystery, whether you want to dive into a classic, you want something to surprise you, or you just want like a nice mystery to read while going to bed. You don't even need to read the previous Poirot mysteries to understand what's going on in here. There's no characterization or events that are referenced that you like, okay, wait, what? And it very much is a great standalone work. I actually didn't know this was the 9th book in the series until I looked it up. And honestly, if I wanted to, I would just sit here and gush about all 270 plus pages of this work. But I'm going to cut it short here for time and move on. I just highly recommend picking up this book if you haven't already. Unfortunately, with that coming to the end, I'm afraid my mood will dampen. I look to the horizon, and I see upon me a great cloud moving forward, coming, never stopping, invoking a sort of melancholy magic upon me. But until then, remember, with every book comes an adventure, and every adventure's worth having, even the bad ones. Have a good day, everyone.